Before Sam Cooke walked onto the Apollo stage, a woman he had never met stopped him in a back corridor. She wasn't a musician, she wasn't a manager, she was a cleaner. And what she said to him in the next 30 seconds changed the entire performance. He had walked away from the wings without planning to. Not away from the stage, just away from the curtain, back into the corridor, needing 30 more seconds of space before the thing began. The corridor was dim and quiet. The sound of the audience was still there, but muffled, present enough to remind him, distant enough to breathe. He had almost made it back to the curtain when he saw her, an older woman, perhaps 65, moving slowly through the corridor with a cloth in her hand. The particular unhurried movement of someone who has been in this building longer than most of the performers who pass through it. She did not look at Sam immediately. She was doing what she was doing, working, present, unimpressed by the proximity of fame in the way of people who have been proximate to fame for long enough to understand that it is not the interesting thing about a person. Then she looked up, and she saw his face, and she stopped.
Sam had been in the building for 2 hours. He had done his warm-up, he had gone over the set list, he had done all the things that 20 years of performing had taught him to do before a show. The specific preparation of a man who knew that what happened on the stage was determined in large part by what happened before it. He was ready. In every technical sense of the word, he was ready. And he was tense in a way that the preparation had not resolved. The Apollo was different. He had known this before he arrived, had been told by people who had played the room, had absorbed the particular weight of its reputation over years of hearing about it from other performers. The Apollo crowd did not give standing ovations at a social obligation. They did not pretend. They had heard the best black musicians in America for 30 years and had developed, through that listening, a precision about what real sounded like that no other audience in the country could match. Sam Cooke had crossed over from gospel to pop. He had built a career on reaching audiences, white audiences, crossover audiences, people who had found his voice through radio stations and record stores. He was very good at reaching those audiences. He had refined the art of it over 8 years of professional performing. The Apollo audience was not those audiences. They would know the difference between the version of Sam Cooke designed for crossover and the version that had existed before, the one that had learned to sing in churches in Mississippi before he understood that singing was a career. His hands were not shaking, but they were not entirely still. He had walked away from the curtain because standing next to it was making the tension worse. The corridor was supposed to help. It had helped, slightly. And then he had seen the woman, and she had stopped, and she was looking at him now with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by anything except the thing that actually mattered. She said, "Why are you so tense?" Sam almost laughed, not from amusement, from the particular surprise of having someone say the true thing out loud when you had been carefully not saying it to yourself. He said, "It's the Apollo." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know where we are."
There was a silence, not uncomfortable, the kind that happens when two people have arrived at the edge of something real and are deciding whether to go further. Sam said, "They're going to know if I'm not the real thing." The woman looked at him steadily. Her expression was not unkind and not particularly sympathetic, more like the expression of someone who has heard a version of this before and knows what it is and knows what it isn't. Not the version that famous people perform when they want to seem relatable, the real version. The specific fear that lives underneath every performer who has ever stood in the wings of any stage and wondered whether what they were carrying was enough. She said, "And are you the real thing?" Sam said, "Yes." She said, "Then what are you worried about?" Sam didn't answer immediately, because the answer was more complicated than yes or no. He was worried about the specific way this audience received things, about whether the version of real that he carried was the version they would recognize. He had crossed over. He had made choices. He had built a career on reaching people who didn't necessarily know what they were hearing, who loved the voice without fully understanding where it came from or what it had cost. And he had become, in the process, very accomplished at a particular kind of performing, at giving audiences what they wanted in ways they could receive. The Apollo crowd was not those audiences. They knew what they were hearing. They would hear the difference between the Sam Cooke who had been built for crossover and the Sam Cooke who had existed before the building began. And Sam, standing in that corridor, was not entirely sure which one was going to walk through the curtain. The woman seemed to understand that he wasn't going to answer. She had a particular stillness, not the stillness of someone waiting for you to speak, but the stillness of someone who is comfortable with silence and does not need it to be filled. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Don't sing to them." Sam looked at her. She said, "Sing to yourself." He didn't say anything. The words landed somewhere specific, not in his mind where he could have analyzed them and found objections, but somewhere lower, somewhere that didn't have language for what it was receiving, but received it anyway. He felt them settle. He felt the particular quality of something true arriving in a place that had been waiting for it without knowing it was waiting. She looked at him one more time. Then she picked up her cloth and continued down the corridor. And Sam stood there for a moment in the dim quiet and then turned and walked back toward the curtain. The first song was controlled. Sam was a craftsman. He knew how to open a show, how to give an audience enough to lean toward without giving them everything immediately. He was doing all of that correctly. The Apollo crowd was listening with the specific quality of 2,000 people who are paying close attention and have not yet decided. Not hostile, not warm, simply present and waiting. He could feel himself performing, could feel the distance between what he was doing and what he was capable of doing, the gap that the woman's words had named without naming it. He was singing to them, trying to reach them, trying to convince them, trying to prove the thing that he had told the woman in the corridor was true. He knew it was true, but the knowing and the showing were different things, and right now he was showing in the way of someone who is aware of being watched. He was not quite there yet. He could feel that, too, could feel the particular quality of a performance that is excellent and is not yet real, that has everything technically correct and is missing the one thing that cannot be technically produced. The crowd could feel it, too, in the way that the Apollo crowd always felt everything. They were with him, but they were with him the way you are with someone when you are waiting for them to arrive. And then, somewhere in the second verse of the second song, the words came back. "Sing to yourself." Sam closed his eyes for just a moment, not dramatically, barely visibly, just long enough to find the place the woman had been pointing at, the place that existed before the Apollo and before the crossover and before the career and before all the careful construction of a public self that he had built brick by brick over 8 years, the place where the voice had come from originally, from church pews in Mississippi, from a boy who sang because the singing was the truest thing he knew how to do, not for an audience, not for approval, just because the music was there and needed to come out. He opened his eyes, and he sang from there. The room felt it happen before it understood it, the particular shift of 2,000 people who have been listening carefully and have just heard something change. Not the notes, not the arrangement, but the thing underneath the notes, the thing that could not be manufactured or performed or aimed at an audience, the thing that simply was or wasn't. It was. One by one, without deciding to, the Apollo crowd settled. Conversations that had been half happening in the back of the room stopped. People who had been leaning back in their seats leaned forward. The particular quality of the room's attention changed, from the attentive watching of people who are assessing to the absorbed receiving of people who have stopped assessing because the question has been answered. Sam felt it from the stage, had learned to feel it over hundreds of performances, the moment when a room stops being an audience and becomes something more like a conversation. He kept going, song after song, building the set the way he knew how, but now from the inside rather than the outside, not performing toward the crowd, simply being in the music and letting the crowd find him there. They found him, completely and without reservation, the way the Apollo crowd found the people they decided were real, with the specific, generous attention of 2,000 people who have stopped withholding and have given themselves over to what is happening in the room. Sam came off the stage after the final encore and stood in the wings for a moment. The sound of the Apollo crowd was still in the room, the particular sound of an audience that has received something and is expressing it without restraint. He had heard crowds before. He had heard larger crowds, louder crowds, crowds in bigger venues with better acoustics. He had never heard quite that sound applied to him in quite that way. The Apollo crowd approving of you was a specific thing. It did not sound like other approval. It sounded like the verdict of people who take the question seriously and have given it their full consideration and have come down on your side. He went looking for the woman. It took him 10 minutes. The corridor where he had seen her was empty, just the dim light and the muffled sound of the crowd still in the house beyond. He went further back into the building, through the service passages that most performers never saw, through the parts of the theater that existed to keep it running rather than to present it. He found her in a side corridor near the loading area, still working, moving with the same unhurried efficiency as before, as if nothing in particular had happened, as if the last 2 hours had been 2 hours like any other in this building she had been working in for however many years. She looked up when he approached. Her expression did not change significantly, not surprise, not the excitement of someone being sought out by a famous person after a triumphant performance, just the same calm attention she had given him in the corridor before the show, the same eyes, the same quality of seeing him without being particularly moved by what she saw. Sam said, "How did you know?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the cloth in her hand, then back at him. Then she said, "I didn't know. I just said what I needed to hear once." Sam looked at her. He said, "When?" She said, "A long time ago. It doesn't matter when." He stood with that for a moment. The noise of the Apollo crowd, still audible even back here, was the sound of what her words had made possible. 2,000 people who had been convinced of something that Sam himself had needed convincing of, and the person who had done the convincing had done it without knowing she was doing it, had reached into her own history, her own need, her own moment of having needed to hear something that nobody had said, and had offered it to a stranger in a corridor 30 seconds before he walked onto the most important stage of his career.
She had not given him advice. She had given him something more useful than advice. She had given him the thing she had once needed and had never received. And in giving it, she had received it too, had heard it finally, spoken in her own voice, landing somewhere it had needed to land for a long time. Sam said, "Thank you." The woman nodded, once, the nod of a person who is receiving something gracefully and moving on. Then she turned back to her work. Sam stood there for another moment in the service corridor of the Apollo Theater, listening to 2,000 people on the other side of several walls expressing their verdict. Then he walked back through the passages, back through the corridor where it had happened, back toward the lights and the noise and everything that was waiting. He had come to the Apollo with everything to prove. He had proved it. Not by reaching toward the audience and convincing them, by stopping reaching, By going to the place the woman had pointed at, the place that had always been there, that had existed long before the Apollo and would exist long after, that no amount of crossover or career management or careful construction could touch, because it was where the voice had come from in the first place. Sing to yourself. 5 words, said by a woman whose name he never learned, in a corridor he would have walked past if he had not needed 30 more seconds of space before the thing began. Said not for him, but for herself, for the version of herself that had once needed to hear them and had not. Arriving finally through his ears, through her own mouth, in a back corridor of the Apollo Theater in Harlem on a night when 2,000 people were waiting to find out if Sam Cooke was real. He was. He always had been. He just needed someone to remind him where to look. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe. Every day we tell the stories behind the music, the 30-second conversations that changed everything. Hit the like button if you believe that the most important things are sometimes said by the people nobody is paying attention to. And tell us in the comments, has a stranger ever said something to you that changed how you saw everything? Because Sam Cooke had that moment in a corridor at the Apollo, and it made the difference between a performance and something real. We'll see you in the next one.